I fear not the dark itself, but what may lurk within it. Welcome to Lurk, bringing you creepy, strange, and bone-chilling stories, with your host, Jamie Jackson.
Hey lurkers, welcome to our first installment of the Stab and Gab Sunday here at Lurk. Once a month, we are going to be releasing a true crime episode on a Sunday that we're calling Stab and Gab Sunday. I cannot take credit for the name. That goes to Liz from So Sci-Fi and Beyond and my daughter Bridget, because the two of them had their own true crime book club, and that's what they called it. Liz will be guest hosting in a true crime episode in the near future, so make sure you tune in for that. Also, a big shout out and thank you to my sister-in-law for bringing this case to my attention. All of the research for this case was done through newspapers.com. This one takes place in 1878 in an area just outside of Hanover, Pennsylvania. It's an area that I've traveled through numerous times, and I have never even heard of this case before. I mean, I wasn't alive in 1878, so there's that, but still, you would think I would know about this one. This is the grisly murder of Christiana Herman. Just to clarify, the victim's name has a couple of variations. The first name is correct, though she often went by the nicknames Anne, Anna, and Annie. The last name is most commonly listed as Herman, though there are also references to Harmon. Because her family is of German descent, I'm guessing the accent is what changes Herman to Harmon. Anyway, back in December of 1878, Christiana Herman was 32 years old and lived about 6 miles northeast of Hanover, Pennsylvania, in Heidelberg Township. She lived with her parents, Frederick and Margaret Herman, her brother Solomon, aged 19, and her 2 children. She had never been married. Her daughter was named Amanda Herman, and she was 7, and her son, Henry J. Slaniker, 12. If the census research I did was accurate. Her brother Solomon was said to be simple-minded and ended up living and dying in the local almshouse, I assume after his parents died. There was another brother named Albert who lived with his family in Lancaster. Anne worked as a seamstress, taking in work to make money. Her father was a stonemason, but was sick and did not work. People in the community said that Anne was lively and cheerful and took part in all the social gatherings in the community. She was said to be popular amongst all the classes, though they also said that she was unfortunate in having been the mother of 2 illegitimate children, which was something that was not looked upon favorably back then. So on the afternoon of December 7th, 1878, Anne Herman heads out to Hanover to go shopping. She bought herself a pair of shoes and some other items before starting for home at around 2 p.m. On her way home, she stopped at the home of Rufus Snyder, which was only about 3/4 of a mile from her house. There was a party of sorts going on with people gathered there to sing. Anne stayed at Rufus Snyder's house until about 8 p.m., which time she took her packages and left for home. Around 10 a.m. on December 8th, a man by the name of Edmund Stauffer was headed to his father's house in Porter's Sidelink when he came upon a grisly scene. It was the body of a woman whose face was unrecognizable, and blood splattered everywhere, mixed with fresh mud and snow. Edmund Stauffer rushed to nearby houses to alert everyone about what he had found. The woman was identified as 32-year-old Christiana Herman. The scene was described in the local paper as follows. Blood was scattered profusely around, while pieces of chestnut club, broken and splintered in the dastardly work, were laying in the road. The head of the victim was battered to jelly. The brains and blood had oozed out and formed a pool. The face was gashed and smeared with blood. The hands put across the breast were also covered with blood. The head was driven into the ground several inches by the force of the crushing blows of the assailant. I find the placing of the hands across the chest intriguing. The murderer used 2 different clubs. The first one broke in the process of the murder. The person then went and cut another club, more primitive, as Christiana stumbled around. The second club was cut from a tree not too far from her house, because the murder actually occurred only about 400 yards from her front door. The murderer continued to beat her until she was dead. Anna's skull was crushed and her brain was exposed. Her lower jaw was fractured and her cheeks cut and bruised. Her head was pressed into the ground and the wounds were inflicted with great force while she was lying down. Blood was scattered a distance of 8 feet. Her clothing was considerably torn, and the body was about 12 feet away from the location of where the attack started. The next day, on Monday, Anna's father accused a local man, Ephraim Snyder, of his daughter's murder. Her mother also voiced her thought that Anna was pregnant at the time of her death. Anna's body was exhumed and was autopsied by 9 separate physicians. In addition to the brutal beating, the killer also shot her through the eye. All the bones in her head were broken. The autopsy proved that Anna was not pregnant at the time of her death. The following was listed as the most likely scenario for how the murder happened. Anna passed the nearby spring walking along the west side of the road when the attacker came from her right and struck a downward blow on the top of her head, knocking her down and hurling her new hat to the spot where it was found, behind her near the spring. The club broke, with the butt end flying in a straight line to the left of the attack. As Anne gathered herself, she screamed, or attempted to scream, and the attacker struck her across the face, below her mouth, gashing her chin and breaking her jaw with a sharp broken end of the club. The attacker tossed the club aside and looked for another. The attacker found another chunk of wood and rushed after the fleeing woman, who was staggering towards her house. The attacker brought the club down on her forehead, killing her, then beat her head into the ground and threw the club into the woods. The attacker then put a pistol to her head and shot her in the face. The area of the murder was described as a gloomy, secluded spot. A bullet was found lying against the rock under Anna's head. It was a .22 for those who are interested. So Ephraim Snyder was accused by Anna's father. But who was he, and why was Anna's father so certain he was the murderer? Ephraim was 25 years old. He had gray eyes and a fair complexion, with a heavy build and a slight mustache. And he spoke fluent German. It was said he couldn't read or write, but those reports were false. German was his native language, and he could read and write just fine, just in German. I'm going to try to piece all the information together as cohesively as possible. Ephraim Snyder was the brother of Rufus Snyder, who was the person hosting the singing party that Anna attended on her way home from shopping in Hanover. He lived with his employer, Samuel Mal. On Saturday night, Ephraim left his home at Mr. Mal's with Mr. Mal, John Elder, and went to singing school at the Mount Carmel schoolhouse. Ephraim Snyder remarked that there was not much promise of a crowd, and if the singing was a failure, he would go to a religious meeting at Christian Miller's a little over 3/4 of a mile from the schoolhouse on the road to New Baltimore. Ephraim stayed at the schoolhouse for about half an hour and then left. Mr. Mal stayed until the singing was over and returned home at 9:30 p.m. Mr. Mal said that Ephraim returned at the house about 15 minutes later. Mal said that Ephraim appeared and acted as usual. He threw his coat on the windowsill, pulled off his boots and set them by the stove, ate an apple, drank some cider, played with Samuel Mal's son, and at about 10 p.m. he went up to bed. Ephraim Snyder said that he did not go to Mr. Miller's and claimed that he had changed his mind and started for Lyshey's church, which was between 3 and 4 miles away. When he was nearly to the church, he heard hallooing, and thinking the meeting was over, Ephraim turned around and returned home. He met no one on the way to the church or the way back home. On Sunday morning, he drove to a Mr. Becker's in North Codorus Township, along with the hired girl who also lived at Mr. Mal's house. They remained at Becker's house until the late afternoon. When he returned to the house, his employer, Mr. Mal, said that bad things had happened up in the mountains last night. Ephraim said nothing. Then Mal said Anne Herman was knocked dead, and Ephraim asked, "Where was she?" Ephraim's clothing was checked for blood, but only one small spot in the pants pocket was found, and Ephraim said it was from a sore finger. That was corroborated. After a search of his room, a 7-shot revolver was found. The chamber was loaded with ball cartridge. The flattened bullet from the crime scene was similar to those found in the gun. Ephraim Snyder was arrested for the murder of Anne Herman. During the investigation, Anna's brother Solomon, who, I will remind you, some kind of intellectual disability, said that Ephraim Snyder told him to give Anna a message. He wanted Anne to be at his brother Rufus's house alone on Saturday night. Anne's mother was present when Solomon delivered the message to Anne from Ephraim Snyder, asking her to meet him. Solomon spoke in German and told her while they were in the front room of the house, evening before. Anne always met Ephraim at his brother's house and always went alone without being asked. Anne's father did not want her to go to Rufus Snyder's house that night. Anne told him that she was going and that he wanted to leave her set in her trouble. I'm going to point out here that I'm pretty sure that means Anne thought her father was preventing her from trying to do something about the fact that she was pregnant, and that's what leave her set in her trouble meant. Ephraim denied his guilt, and he denied there was a plan to meet Anne. In an interview with the York Dispatch after his arrest, Ephraim said he learned of the murder Sunday evening. He did not go to church Sunday because he was going Saturday evening to a Sunday school institute, but ended up not going because he thought it was over. Sunday morning, he and the housemaid went to Edward Becker's house in Porter Sidling until about 4:30 p.m., then went to Miller's house. He was acquainted with Anne Herman and said he had not called on her as a suitor. He said, "I had been with her several times, but was not a beau of her." He knew her for about 2 to 3 years. He said he walked home with her several times from his brother's house, and the last time was in October. He said he did not visit her the Saturday before the murder. Ephraim also said that he did not send a message to Anne that he wanted to meet her that night. He said they never spoke about marriage, and Anne had never urged him to marry her for certain reasons. At the end of the interview, Ephraim made sure to stress that he was able to read and write. My personal take on that last bit is that he had issues with being labeled illiterate. It's a stretch, but it seems like a narcissistic kind of thing. You're being accused of murder, but by God, don't you dare call me illiterate and say I can't read and write. Ephraim was alleged to have been criminally intimate with Anne. I believe this basically means that he had sex with her out of wedlock. Anne's mother was interviewed and said this. On Saturday previous to the murder, F and Annie had a conversation at the fence, and I think that she was then urging him to marry her. On various occasions, she had asked him to fulfill his promise, but he always put her off by saying, "I will be as good as my promise." I never knew him to make any threat against her. Some time ago, my suspicions were aroused that all was not right with Anne. F had been going around saying that he has not kept company with my daughter since before harvest. This is not so, for he has not only been with her, but has been here to the house since that time. There were 2 other people who were arrested for suspicion of having something to do with Anne's murder. A tramp named Alexander Osborne was arrested, but it was later learned that he was only repeating things he learned from others and wasn't actually involved in the murder. Later, the York Daily Record reported that others had been mentioned as culprits in the murder, and one man by the name of Sipling was arrested. Nothing came from this. There was also some question as to Anne's whereabouts from 9 p.m. until about 10 p.m., prior to the murder, but after she left the party. The murder had to have happened after 9 p.m. because of the numerous meetings in the area and the amount of people walking about once the meetings were over. It was deduced that she was somehow detained by the murderer because she was not in any of the other gatherings after she left Rufus Snyder's house. Also, her brother Solomon made a statement that he walked home, passing through the same area where the murder happened at approximately 9:30 p.m., and her body was not there at the time. On May 2, 1879, Ephraim Snyder was put on trial for the murder of Anne Herman. There was a lot of back and forth about a supposed burr on her coat, and that there was reportedly a plant that the burr came from near the hog pen at Rufus Snyder's house. I was a little confused about what the big deal was, but apparently Ephraim and Anne would go meet out by the hog pen, and I guess do the nasty somewhere in the area. Not my idea of a romantic get-together. Not a place that I'm going to want to do that. Hog pen does not scream tryst to me. Just saying. There was never any definitive answer about whether or not there was a burr plant there or if it was even distinct enough to be narrowed down to a specific plant. According to testimony during the trial from Anne's parents, Anne was a small person and never married. Ephraim visited Anne for 5 years. They would take walks together. Ephraim would come around dusk to the house and sometimes during the day and stayed as late as 1 a.m. and 4 a.m. Margaret Herman, Anne's mother, said Ephraim came most often on Sundays. She said, "I once saw them do things that was not usual to do. They were on the floor. It was at night." Guess what that was? Anne's brother Solomon returned home, and afterwards the Herman dogs, along with the neighbor's dogs, began carrying on. The neighbor, Elder Rogers, said he went to bed about 10 p.m., and his dogs and the Herman's dogs started barking around 10:30. He also heard 1 gunshot. The dogs were barking prior to the gunshot being heard. Solomon said that he spoke to a Samuel Sipling on the way home that night near where his sister was killed. Several people testified that after Ephraim returned from an extended trip to Kansas, he told them about how the laws in Kansas were not as strict as in Pennsylvania. He said if anyone was killed there in Kansas, it wasn't looked into very closely. Rebecca Snyder, wife to Rufus Snyder and Ephraim's sister-in-law, said Anne told her she was in that situation. Rebecca told Ephraim. Anne said if he did not marry her, she knew what she would do. Ephraim said he thought not. This was a couple of weeks before the murder. The Sunday before the murder, Rebecca saw Anne wink at Ephraim and they walked off toward the hog pen. Ephraim's brother James Snyder was present when Rebecca told Ephraim that Anne said she knew what she could do if he didn't marry her. Ephraim said that he didn't know how she could put that on him. This was about a month prior to the murder. Rufus Snyder, brother to Ephraim, and the person hosting the party Anne attended the night of her murder, said Ephraim and Anne were together at his house. Annie went out first, then Ephraim. It was after dark. He also said he saw Solomon outside passing the house around 10 p.m. Then a woman by the name of Amelia Hauser testified. She was Ephraim's fiancée. Amelia testified that she and Ephraim had known each other for 5 years, and he visited her every 2 weeks. They had been engaged for a year. They were set to be married near Easter, but that was postponed and rescheduled, so they would have been married 3 or 4 weeks after the murder happened. Amelia had heard of Anne Herman but didn't know her, and Ephraim had never mentioned her. They never did end up marrying. The jury deliberated for an hour and a half and reached a verdict of not guilty. Ephraim went on to marry a woman by the name of Amanda Bear. Solomon, as I mentioned earlier, died in an almshouse. No info on what became of Anne's children. So now I'm going to share my opinion of what happened here. Honestly, after reading a few small blurbs, I was pretty confident that Ephraim was innocent. And then I started reading the newspaper interviews and realized that while the autopsy proved Anne was not pregnant, she either had symptoms and believed she was, or she wanted to be married so badly that she was lying. It's obvious that Ephraim was using her for sex. Maybe she was using him for sex too, I don't really know. Perhaps Anne might have been a little lacking in the smarts department or was very easily persuaded to do things. She was unmarried, and the 2 children she had did not share last names, so she obviously had sexual relations with men who did not marry her. I considered perhaps someone else from the area might have murdered Anne because maybe they made advances that she rebuffed. The murder was brutal, and then the hands arranged on her chest. It seemed to be a sign of a lot of passion and rage. More like someone who was more invested in a relationship with Anne, and then maybe some regret. Ephraim immediately began to distance himself from Anne, saying he was only friends and that he hadn't met up with her recently, and those were refuted by her family, who testified under oath that they were seen having sex and that he was meeting her at the house a week before the murder. He also went off to the house of a person the next day when her body was found. He went with the maid, and it wasn't something he normally did, but it got him away from the area when he knew she was going to be found. I think Anne either thought she was pregnant or lied and told Ephraim, expecting him to do the right thing by her and marry her. But he wanted nothing of it. He had another woman he was engaged to. So he has Anne hounding him weeks before he's supposed to get married, and she's potentially pregnant. And I think he was done, and he stopped. There was mention that he possibly confessed on his deathbed in his 80s. Years afterwards, the ghost story started. People have claimed to have seen her ghost walking the woods along the road on cold, windy, dark nights. On other nights, she can be heard moaning as she lays dying. So on that side note, that's going to do it for this episode of Lurk. As always, you can find us wherever you listen to podcasts, like Spotify or iHeartRadio or Apple Podcasts. You can also find episodes on our website, lurkpodcast.com. Our social media links are there, along with the new blog, so make sure you check that out. We have completely redesigned the website, so make sure you go and take a look. We're also starting a monthly newsletter, so make sure you sign up for that on the website. And until next time, keep lurking.